The Hürtgen forest was on the southern edge of Aachen and completely protected the city. The Ardennes forest was 40 miles farther south, and the Germans had an advantage in the Hürtgen forest because a large portion of German equipment was still being drawn by horses. Monty had planned for the Americans to march to the city of Aachen and allowed them exactly enough gasoline and ammunition to get there, but no further. And Monty had issued written orders to that effect, while the Germans were busy on the other side of the forest, stockpiling reinforcements as far as the eye can see, to drive the Americans out of Europe and back into the ocean. Monty would be up in Arnhem at the bridge too far, unable to come to the assistance of the Americans being overrun 100 miles to the south in the upcoming Battle of the Bulge, and that would leave the British justifiably forced to come to Aachen to make peace with the Germans, just as Napoleon had been forced to surrender in the exact same scenario, when one of his French generals had sided with the Prussians, refusing to come to Napoleon's aid during the Battle of Waterloo, which had not been seen as a betrayal by that officer, but done with the best intentions of putting an overdue end to the war. That French officer had been holed up with the British in the chateau at Hürtgen on the morning of the Battle of Waterloo, and Napoleon spent too much time and treasure trying to storm that chateau first thing in the morning, and it should have come as no surprise to Napoleon that the haircut he'd taken when marching into the Russian winter, where he lost most of his best officers, would have encouraged the resurgence of royalist sympathizers like the second Marquis of Grouchy, whose father was rumoured to have been the illegitimate son of Louis XV. Grouchy had been sent to Ireland in 1796 to organize the Irish to rise up against their British masters, and who knows what British gentleman Grouchy befriended there in his stint as a prisoner of war. The French fleet had been sent by Napoleon to Bantry Bay during the worst winter in 100 years, and the French were wrecked by storms off the rocky coast of Ireland, losing 12 ships and 2,000 sailors, with the only Frenchmen reaching shore taken by the British as POWs. Perhaps Grouchy had met the first Viscount of Exmouth, whose family had originally come from Normandy, and Exmouth was 10 years older than Grouchy and had been the British officer arresting those invading French sailors in 1796, among whom was the 30-year-old Grouchy. Exmouth's family had owned a tobacco plantation in Annapolis before the American colonies broke away from the Crown, and when Exmouth was 18 years old, he'd been one of the crew of a Royal Navy ship and got into a fight with the captain, who put him ashore at Marseille, where Exmouth found refuge with old friends of his father. In 1776, Exmouth had sailed to America with the Royal Navy at the age of 19, and fought on Lake Champlain in the Battle of Valcour Island, where he was severely wounded. And then Exmouth fought at First Saratoga in September of 1777, where his younger brother was killed. And at First Saratoga, the British had been surrounded and had been made to surrender, when the promised English armies had failed to march soon enough to meet them for battle. After Saratoga, Exmouth was a POW for a few months until he was returned to England, and it had been that surrender at First Saratoga that had convinced France and Spain to formally join the hostilities on the side of the Americans, while before the French had only supplied munitions and materiel. When France joined the battle, Benedict Arnold was stripped of his command after First Saratoga for complaining about the French coming in. And despite being sidelined, Benedict Arnold jumped in at Second Saratoga the following month in October, where he took the wound to his leg that put him in the hospital, where he learned to depend on opium. Exmouth would continue to serve in the Royal Navy, doing a daring and impressive duty until he earned all his stripes, and he fully participated in the fight against Napoleon, trying to free Europe from its nobility. And while Exmouth had not been born noble, he was certainly a sympathizer, and had been promoted to Rear Admiral in 1804, then made Commander-in-Chief of the East Indies Station, and then of the entire Mediterranean. These officers from opposing armies had known each other for decades, or at least knew of each other, and making deals among themselves before battles would not have been beyond the realm of possibility. The irony of it was that Exmouth had been born common, but had worked himself up to the upper echelons, while Grouchet was born noble and had become an ardent fan of the French Revolution. Grouchet had also been taken prisoner in 1799 at the Battle of Novi in Italy, where he'd been captured by the Austrians, and he was returned to France and fought at the Battle of Hohenlinden in December of 1800, where the victorious French gave the lovely port of Trieste to Austria in the surrender terms. At the Battle of Hohenlinden, Grouchet had been the foremost commander responsible for the French collecting over 30,000 Austrian and Bavarian prisoners. And the armistice was called on Christmas Day, and in the wake of this victory at Hohenlinden, Napoleon decided to become an emperor rather than just a liberator, so that the nobility of Europe would accept him as one of them and stop making war against his new France. After Hohenlinden, Grouchet became a favorite of Napoleon, serving on all the battlefields for the next 14 years. And the year before Waterloo, Grouchet had been severely wounded, fighting the same Prussian general he was supposed to attack during the Battle of Waterloo. Grouchet had both been taken prisoner by and taken prisoners from the same class of noble people into which he'd been born, and after 22 years of the Napoleonic Wars, it is more than likely that he may have seen the only hope for a future of peace for France through the defeat of his own commander-in-chief. And then again, perhaps the recalcitrant Grouchet knew that the nobility would never accept Napoleon as one of them, and that France was headed for destruction through the Emperor Napoleon's attempt to be invited into their ranks. In the wood, along the wall of the garden, and round the farmyard itself, huge numbers of French, the whole of an infantry division, had already marched into the fire of the Germans and British hidden behind the walls and among the trees. Larriguet retained a dreadful impression of being splashed with blood, of his own feet being wet with it, as if he had waded in it, and of expecting second by second to be killed or horribly wounded. But he also remembered the exaltation of it, how the wounded refused to leave the field, and how the dying called down blessings on the Emperor, how his own captain, shot through by 2 musket balls, kept urging them on in a voice that grew weaker until he fell. Waterloo, a near-run thing by David Howarth, Gloucester, the Windrush Press, 1968, page 56 and 7. The fight at Hürtgen raged for an hour and a half before anything else happened on the battlefield, except that the cannon shot which missed the chateau still came bounding through the ranks of waiting men and picked off a victim here and there. Sergeant Wheeler, with an old soldier's luck, was posted in the sunken lane far on the right, where the road to Nieville crossed it by a bridge, and from that safe billet he watched the shot going over. Sulkily he went down and waited beside the orchard. There was nobody in sight. Shot and shell were still coming over the hill from the direction of Hürtgen. It seemed to him a dismal situation. While he was waiting, he was astonished to see a tall, upright old gentleman, unarmed and in civilian clothes, who came galloping across his front, followed by 2 younger men, and vanished in the direction of the sounds of battle. This bizarre apparition was the Duke of Richmond, with his 16-year-old son and an attendant. Where he'd come from at that moment in the bottom of the valley was to remain a mystery, but he spent most of the afternoon riding about the battlefield, chatting to his friends and occasionally shouting encouragement to the troops. Waterloo, a near-run thing, page 58 and 9. The 19 Corps, 2 days' march behind the others because of a gasoline shortage that had portentous overtones, headed for the open country north of Aachen. Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, page 14. Though the First Army received 1,000 tons of ammunition on September 11, not until 4 days later would enough be on hand at the front for 5 days of intensive fighting. Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, page 18. Authorized to make no full-scale attack, only a reconnaissance in force, Collins was to seize the high ground overlooking Aachen. As the troops headed for the border on September 12, few on the German side of the Dragon's Teeth could discern any real hope of holding until the promised new division arrived. The city of Aachen that night, for example, was Moscow, with Napoleon on the march after Borodino. A non-Nazi, almost an anti-Nazi, the German commander charged with defense of the city, General von Schwerin, still was regrouping his 116th Panzer Division north of the city. His depleted forces, he believed, were no match for the Americans bearing down on him. If the fall of Aachen within a few hours was inevitable, Schwerin reasoned, why subject the proud old coronation capital to further destruction? Entering Aachen around nightfall, Schwerin found the civilian population in a panic. The Nazis, he learned, had ordered all civilians to flee to the east. To a man who believed the Americans would arrive in a matter of hours, and even that the end of the war was not too many days away, this appeared ridiculous. Schwerin promptly sent officers to police headquarters with orders to halt the evacuation, only to learn to his dismay that not only the police but all government and Nazi officials had already fled. Not a policeman was to be found. Thoroughly piqued, Schwerin sent his officers into the streets to halt the Hegira themselves. Meanwhile, Schwerin at last came upon one civilian official still at his post, an employee of the telephone service. To this man Schwerin entrusted a letter in Schwerin's own impeccable English to be given to the incoming American commander. I stopped the absurd evacuation of this town, therefore I am responsible for the fate of its inhabitants, and I ask you to take care of the unfortunate population in a humane way. I am the last German commanding officer in the sector of Aachen. Signed, Schwerin. Unfortunately for Count Gerhard von Schwerin, the order to evacuate Aachen had come from the pen of the Führer himself. Also unfortunately for Schwerin, the American commander, General Collins, had no intention of moving immediately into Aachen. Schwerin had written a letter he would come to rue. As daylight came the next day, September 13, General Collins still had no authority to make a genuine attack. Displeased by the preceding day's delays, Collins determined nevertheless to make what was in effect a full-scale attack, even though he continued to call it a, quote, reconnaissance in force. Taking a battalion from the 1st Division to reinforce his armor, he turned the rest of the 1st Division loose to break through the pillbox belt close to Aachen and gain the high ground in a half-moon arc around the city, there to await juncture with the 19 Corps from the north to complete the encirclement. As German gunners awoke to what was happening and began to shell the roadway, hope of breaking into the fortified line might have faded again had not a tank platoon leader, Lieutenant John R. Hoffman, and the commander of the flail tank, Sergeant Sviri Wijidal, braved the fire to hitch 2 tanks to the Scorpion and pull it from the mud. Climbing back into the flail tank, Wijidal gunned the motor for a second try. This time he rumbled across. But though few in number, the men of the German 9th Panzer Division were an intrepid lot. With Panzerfausts, they quickly knocked out 4 of the American tanks, then gained additional heart with the arrival of 3 assault guns that only a few hours before had been unloaded from a train in Aachen. The assault guns quickly knocked out 6 of the Shermans. As daylight came on September 14, and Joe Collins could at last officially label his advance an attack, it became readily apparent that Germans here were members of the local security battalions General Schock had placed under the headquarters of the 353rd Infantry Division to hold the Schill line. Before daylight the next morning, September 15, the men of the battalion slipped away in the darkness. When Task Force Lovelady's tanks crossed a newly constructed bridge over the Vicht around noon on the 15th, the pillboxes of the Schill line were silent, empty. 2 miles beyond the river, the armor passed the last of the fortifications and headed for open country. More toward the center, CCA made comparable progress on September 14, but paused the next morning until infantrymen of the 1st Division could seize high ground directly east of Aachen. It took the rest of the afternoon and another assist from infantry of the 1st Division before the assault guns fled and CCA gained the nest of pillboxes. Yet as the armor coiled for the night, only a few scattered fortifications remained. From the German viewpoint, CCA's success was all the more distressing because it had broken contact between the 116th Panzer Division in Aachen and what remained of the 9th Panzer Division in the Stolberg corridor. Despite continued advances by the American armor, General Schock still sided with General von Schwerin in the belief that the Americans intended to assault the city. Since American infantry on September 15 had occupied the high ground in a semicircle around Aachen, they obviously planned to move against the city the next day. As for Schwerin, he himself had troubles apart from the American threat. The panic which had struck the civilian population the night of September 12, recrudesced during September 14, and with it came a special order from Hitler himself. All civilians, the Fuhrer directed, were to be evacuated from Aachen, by force if necessary. Still convinced that the Americans soon would enter Aachen, reluctant to expose the civilians to the apparently unnecessary hardship of fleeing, Schwerin nevertheless had no choice but to concur. When the police and Nazi officials returned to Aachen on September 15, they found the evacuation again underway, but this was not sufficient to keep Schwerin out of trouble. The letter the general had written to the incoming American commander fell quickly into Nazi hands. "You are relieved of your command," the Nazi officials told Schwerin, "to stand trial before Hitler's People's Court." Absurd, the fractious. Schwerin snorted. "Aachen will fall. The war will soon be over." Of a quick end to the war, Schwerin was certain. As long ago as July, he'd been so sure the war was lost that he had agreed to serve as emissary to the Allies if the plot to kill Hitler succeeded. Nor was relief from his command anything new to Schwerin. Only a few weeks before, when he had disregarded an order to join in a futile counterattack, his superiors had relieved him, but it had not been long before they relented. Everybody knew how loyal the men of the 116th Panzer Division were to Schwerin, from whose ancestral landholdings the original cadre for the division had come. Gathering about him troops of the 116th Panzer Division's reconnaissance battalion, Schwerin took refuge behind a cordon of machine guns in a farmhouse near Aachen. Here he would wait out the imminent fall of the city and the end of the war. Schwerin must have watched with considerable dismay during the next few days as no further American move against Aachen developed. A week later he established communication with his old friend Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief in the West, and asked for help. Elsewhere on September 15, the German corps commander in the Stolberg corridor in desperation opened fire from the flanks, knocking out 7 medium tanks and a tank destroyer. On September 16, the 5th day of the 7 Corps attack, both armored combat commands had advanced approximately 10 miles into Germany. On the other hand, down at the fighting man's level, nobody could be quite so elated, for as night came on the 16th, disturbing reports began to filter in. Just before dark, for example, a patrol from the 1st Division spotted an enemy column in the distance, stretching, quote, as far as the eye can see, close quote. Through the night, almost every unit along the front noted the noise of heavy motor traffic behind German lines. In the meantime, all through the night of the 16th, Brandenberger's main hope for thwarting the American attack, the fresh 12th Infantry Division, continued to arrive at railroad stations along the Roer River. Numbering 14,800 men, the 12th Division was a welcome, heartening, even exhilarating sight. Taking leave of the 5 Corps to fly to Washington to testify in a congressional investigation, Leonard Garrow told his men he expected the war would be over before he got back. The same day that the 12th Division appeared on the Stolberg corridor, 3 Allied airborne divisions came to earth in the Netherlands in the war's largest airborne assault. They were supposed to gain a bridgehead over the lower reaches of the Rhine River, outflank the entire Siegfried Line, and set the stage for a rapid thrust across the northern plain, possibly to Berlin. Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, page 46 through 76. To the 9th Division Commander General Craig, it was apparent by nightfall of September 16 that the 39th Infantry alone could not even push through the Monschau corridor, much less clear the sprawling Hürtgen Forest. All 3 battalions of the regiment already were in the line, all seriously under strength, from the ravages of the pursuit and the early pillbox fighting, nor was assistance to be expected. Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, page 69. Apart from limited numbers of tanks and tank destroyers, the U.S. troops had arrived ill-equipped for assaulting a fortified line. Coming up the pillboxes at the end of a long pursuit, they had at hand few prepared demolition charges, Bangalore torpedoes, parenthesis, lengths of pipe filled with explosives, close parenthesis, flamethrowers, or other special equipment. Alternating haze and light rain at the same time had denied major contribution by tactical aircraft. Units were under strength, the men tired, and by nightfall of the 16th, every major combat unit of 7 Corps was in the line, stretched to the limit. With the 5 Corps engaged deep in the Ardennes Eifel, and the 19 Corps fighting to reach the Siegfried Line north of Aachen, the First Army commander, General Hodges, had nothing to send to help. What was more, ammunition was dangerously low, particularly for the artillery's main weapon, the 105mm howitzer. Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, page 71. On the American side, the First Army commander, General Hodges, still had been able to achieve little concentration for renewing the drive to the Rhine. Because the elongated front in the Ardennes Eifel remained a First Army responsibility, the divisions of Leonard Garrow's 5 Corps could make only minor shifts northward. General Kortlitz's 19 Corps had fallen unhappy heir to an exposed north flank, more than 30 miles long, which had developed after the British had driven northward into the Netherlands rather than northeastward alongside the First Army. The open flank took on disturbing proportions after the big airborne assault to assist the British advance fell short of a bridgehead over the lower reaches of the Rhine River and far short of outflanking the Siegfried Line. Only the impending arrival of 3 veteran divisions that had been fighting to reduce a stubborn holdout in the port of Brest, far back in France, was their promise of substantially augmenting the First Army. Once these divisions arrived, one might cover the the exposed north flank of the 19 Corps, while the others assumed the defensive job in the Ardennes Eifel. Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, page 91 and 2. On clear days, American planes joined the assault, but without notable effect. Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, page 80. As soon as Monty's Arnhem adventure failed, General Hans Schmidt was put in charge of keeping the Americans out of the Hürtgen Forest, right by one of Goering's hunting preserves, and the huge mass of German soldiers that would come pouring through Aachen and the Ardennes for the Battle of the Bulge were heavy with untrained teenagers and slow old men, but Hitler would not need experts to force the Americans out after the British waved a signed peace treaty at them. The British were still well rested and well fed and knew exactly where all the Americans' support positions and headquarters were located, and the RAF pilots would be able to take over the enormous array of airplanes left behind when all the American pilots in England were loaded onto boats bound for America, and the RAF would be able to hurry the American army back out of France. By early October, ammo was still in such short supply to the Americans that they could not defend themselves for more than 1 day, and they had no more than 2 days' worth of gasoline, and only one ammo ship was offloaded at Normandy, while 35 ammo ships were waiting in the harbor. Churchill was blaming the railroad and dock workers back in England for the supply problems, and the aerial bombing had destroyed all the railroads and bridges in France, and even though the Americans had rebuilt many of the railroads at superhuman speed with the help of the French, few precious French trains remained, and Churchill claimed the rolling stock back in England was needed for civilian use. Monty had quote-unquote borrowed most of the bridge-building equipment belonging to the Americans and had promised to send supplies to the Americans if they agreed to his plan for capturing Aachen, something he claimed would so demoralize the Germans that they would all surrender. So Hodge's First Army was resupplied on the 2nd of October, but remained under severe ammo restrictions, and Bradley estimated that the American army would be completely out of ammo by the 7th of November, despite the Operation Aachen resupply. The American army had not been given enough supplies to do more than survive the march to Aachen, and had barely enough ordnance and weaponry to even damage the town. And bombing by air was denied them because of the close proximity of soldiers to the enemy. It looked like a clear victory for Britain, but the Americans foiled the plot by fighting through the Hürtgen Forest, sneaking in behind the entrenched Germans, and pretending on paper and on telephones and radios that they held the town of Schmidt, and in so doing cut off the only road to Cologne, even though the reality was that only a handful of incredibly brave Americans had come into the town of Schmidt, laid a few unburied mines on the roads facing the Germans, and made themselves comfortable in enough of the houses for the Schmittians to spread the news by telephone that the Americans had arrived. Major Houston and other American intelligence officers were engaging in the dangerous game of killing off the German army on paper. Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, page 98. 2 strongholds on the road between Schmidt and Aachen were stubbornly held by Germans until the 29th of September. But the Americans were able to prevent any British negotiators from entering into Aachen on the 14th of October, and the Americans had accomplished this against staggering odds and without any clear idea of where they were supposed to be going or why, but had followed their orders as best they could and trusted God to do the rest. Meeting at Brussels on October 18, the Supreme Commander General Eisenhower directed Bradley's 12th Army Group, and specifically Hodge's First Army, to make the main effort. Attacking early in November, the First Army was to cross the Rhine south of Cologne. On October 21, the same day that General Hodges received his instructions, Aachen fell. Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, page 133 and 4. November 2 dawned cold and misty. A 12,000-round artillery preparation, sizable for a one-division attack, began at 8 o'clock, an hour before the infantry was scheduled to move. But not until mid-afternoon were any fighter aircraft able to operate. Even then most planes failed to locate assigned targets, roaming instead far afield in search of other targets. Probably the most notable air action of the day was a mistaken bombing of an American artillery position that killed 7 men and wounded 17. At 9 o'clock, men of 2 battalions of the 109th Infantry rose from foxholes and slit trenches and headed north, digging in at the woods line overlooking Hürtgen. But the other battalion, almost at the start, ran into a dense anti-personnel minefield. Every time engineers tried to clear the mines, machine guns and mortars drove them to cover. The next day, November 3, the battalion east of the road were seeking to flank the minefield when some 200 Germans struck the battalion at the woods line. The 28th Division's main effort began at noon with an attack by the rest of the 112th Infantry under Lieutenant Colonel Carl L. Peterson, a slender, wiry man with reddish-blonde hair and a mustache, who had grown up in Pennsylvania among the miners, oil field workers, and tradesmen who even now constituted the hard core of the National Guard Regiment's non-commissioned officers. Already the forest here had begun to look like a battlefield designed by the arch-fiend himself. Shelling had made a debris-littered jungle of the forest floor and cut naked yellow gashes on the trunks of the trees. Here opposing lines were within hand-grenade range, the Germans waiting behind thick entanglements of concertina barbed wire, alive with tripwires, mines, booby traps. Log-covered bunkers and foxholes almost flush with the ground augmented the pillboxes. Over it all hung a dim macabral light, filtered by dripping branches of dark green firs. No sooner had the attacking troops risen from their foxholes than a rain of machine gun and mortar fire brought them to earth. Though men of one battalion worked their way slowly, painfully, up to the triple band of concertinas surrounding the pillboxes, they could go no further. In mid-afternoon, the battalion reeled back, dazed and stricken, to the line of departure. It was much the same with the other battalion. Squads and platoons got lost, mortar shells landing among assault teams carrying explosive charges set off the explosives and blew up the men, and unfailing chatter of machine guns ripped through the trees whenever anybody moved. The grave, dedicated, what choice did they have infantrymen got up again from their holes whenever the non-coms and the lieutenants told them to. With no supporting fire in back of them, they were quickly cut down by the Germans. Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, page 145. The second fact about the enemy the 28th Division could not have known. The preceding day, November 2, at almost the same moment, the 28th Division had begun to attack. Staff officers and commanders of Army Group B, the 7th Army, and several corps and divisions, including Straub's 74th Corps, had sat down in a castle near Cologne to play a war game. Conducted by Field Marshal Model, the steadfast B-monocled Army Group B commander, the game was based on a theoretical American attack near Hürtgen. Hardly had the play opened when a telephone call came from the 74th Corps telling of the American thrust and begging reinforcements. Ibid. Not a bullet, not a shell came from the Germans. Fording the cold, swift-flowing Little Cal River, the men picked away up the steep slope beyond. The men got to Schmidt soon after midday. The darkness that comes early in northern Europe at this time of year had fallen before the last of the German snipers could be mopped up and defensive positions for the night established. But incredible as it may seem, troops of the 18th Division had captured Schmidt. Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, page 151. The Germans quickly overran Schmidt, of course, and then did the Bulge. But the fact that the Americans had held that town for one day had caused Hitler to stop trusting his British contacts, who had sworn that the Americans could be made to follow British orders. When the American soldiers went into Schmidt, Hitler let go of his last lifeline with Britain, and from that day onward, the British would talk only to Himmler. The Bulge would fail from lack of coordinated command. Some Germans fighting for the fatherland, some fighting under orders from Hitler, and some taking orders from Himmler and his British friends, and keeping troop movements secret among the different factions within the German army, proved too much for anyone trying to make sense of the battlefield after the Americans had succeeded in surrounding Aachen. Thereafter, the Americans began regularly broadcasting inaccurate forward troop movements to their British allies because the Americans needed to forestall the threat of being bombed by friendly fire. And that went a long way towards giving the Americans freedom to move in the theater on their own initiative, while the British newspapers were blaring stories of American advances and American troop movements. Bradley kept a handful of British journalists and officers on a tight leash at his headquarters, giving daily briefings that the world press followed, even though most of his reports were false gains intended to keep Bomber Command away from American troops. On the night of November 4, for example, word reached Courtney Hodges at 1st Army Headquarters that the troops beyond the Cal had attacked during the afternoon to retake Schmidt and had gained 300 yards. The fact was that nobody had attacked and nobody gained anything. Indeed, so depleted was the force beyond the Cal that there was no longer any question of attacking but of trying to hold on. The 28th Division's holdings beyond the Cal were reduced now to a small defensive perimeter at the woods line. This nobody actually on the scene had any hope of holding for long, and for once those away from the scene saw it the same way. The next day, November 8, while a new commander for what remained of the 112th Infantry made his way beyond the Cal with orders to pull everybody back during the night, the fate that had befallen the 28th Division brought a galaxy of American commanders to Coda's command post. Not only Garrow and Hodges, but the Army Group Commander General Bradley and the Supreme Commander General Eisenhower attended. The second attack on Schmidt had developed into one of the most costly actions to be fought by a United States division during World War II. The 112th Infantry alone lost 167 men killed, 431 missing, parenthesis, most of whom were later declared killed, close parenthesis, 232 captured, 719 wounded, and 544 hospitalized for non-battle causes, including combat exhaustion and respiratory diseases. The entire 28th Division, including attached units, incurred 6,184 casualties. The Germans lost about half that number. Though parts of the 28th Division continued to attack for another 5 days in an effort to seize the rest of the woods line overlooking Hürtgen and to conquer the pillboxes at Rafflesbrand. These were prodigious assignments far beyond the means of a unit which had taken such a physical and spiritual beating as had the 28th Division. When the division at last was relieved and moved to a relatively quiet defensive sector in the Ardennes, parenthesis, there to be hit a month later by the winter counteroffensive, close parenthesis, the lines remained basically what they had been after the third day's fighting, except that nobody now stood beyond the Cal. The Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, page 163, 180-3. This situation made the author unhappy, but it was good enough to derail the separate peace plan at Aachen that had been a sure thing, coupled with Monty's market garden that had been intended to fail. Yet for all the failure to get tanks across the Kel, the map in the 28th Division's command post the night of November 3 reflected a surprising number of accomplishments. While the 109th Infantry had gained only half its objective at the woods line overlooking Hürtgen, the regiment was well placed to thwart counterattack from the direction of Hürtgen. Division and corps commanders all along the front began to telephone their congratulations. The Battle of the Hürtgen Forest, page 154. Monty had launched Market Garden on the 17th of September, the same day that the U.S. Constitution had been approved by the U.S. Congress in 1787. And as the British left for Arnhem 100 miles to the north of Aachen, a gap had opened up for the Germans to come through to outflank the Americans, but Bradley had ordered his troops to thin out, and that would be why the lines in front of the Ardennes were so tenuously held in the Battle of the Bulge. Because Patton was moving forward down south thanks to Dragoon, and because the Americans had encircled Aachen, there was no chance for Monty to succeed in a separate peace that September during Market Garden. And of the 9,000 British who parachuted into Arnhem, less than 2,500 came back after Monty finally gave them permission to withdraw on the 25th of September, an exceptionally bitter day for Monty, since the 25th of September in 1066 had been the day the English king had been too busy up north fighting the Vikings over Stamford Bridge to stop William the Conqueror from coming ashore unopposed to the south. Bradley had called a meeting of the American commanders on the 9th of October, and Supply had promised to fix the strangulation of supplies in 2 weeks, but could not break the British blockade even by the 2nd of November, and Monty was holding out until the November elections in America, when a president more friendly to British interests was sure to be elected, and FDR's defeat at the polling stations was almost guaranteed after all the bad press the American army had been getting in the newspapers. At the same time, the British press had been reporting that Monty was promising to end the war by Christmas. There were Germans with superior anti-tank guns hidden in the woods around Aachen, and both American generals in command had experienced the Argonne Forest in the Great War and knew they needed to take the Hürtgen Forest overlooking Aachen, even though the German General Schmidt had sent 6,000 more soldiers into the woods there. Because on the high ground on the other side of the Hürtgen Forest, right outside the town of Schmidt, there were 2 reservoirs built during the 30s called the Erft and the Schwamenau that were holding water 3 miles upstream into Germany. If the Germans blew those dams, 42,000 acre-feet of water from the Erft and 81,000 acre-feet of water from the Schwamenau would come flooding downstream to wipe out everything in its path, and that would include all the American soldiers in the area. The Americans wanted to bypass Aachen by going around the rear of the Hürtgen Forest to capture those dams. But Monty insisted on bombing the dams instead, and after hundreds of sorties, he was never able to make more than a small breach, even though the Schwamenau Dam was almost a quarter-mile wide, and the continual specifically targeted aerial bombing was keeping the Americans out of the entire area around the dams. The most striking feature of these weeks was the Americans having to use color-coded tarps to cover their tanks and trucks and equipment in an attempt to shield them from the constant aerial friendly fire that had everyone on extreme alert. These were indeed perilous times, and of the 450 bombers that had been in the first wave on the 2nd of October, at the beginning of the Battle of Aachen, none had managed to hit a single German pillbox. The American First Army had Aachen encircled on the 14th of October, when the King of England had flown over to First Army's command post near Verviers in Belgium, that Bradley described as a very muddy place. And Bradley's CP had still been in a canvas tent despite the oncoming winter, And that same day, Bradley would move his Eagle CP from Verdun to Luxembourg, 12 miles from the German border. It had been Ike's 54th birthday on that 14th of October, and they all had to sit around with the King of England sipping tea. The Germans had started planning the Bulge right after the Arnhem adventure was over, and they were hiding their supplies and ammo in the Hürtgen forest, and they needed to be ready to blow the Roer River dams, to wipe out all the bridges all the way to Antwerp, and isolate the Americans' 1st and 9th Army away from the Bulge. And despite all the Allied bombing thus far, Germany reached its peak of wartime production in October of 1944. General Marshall had flown over on October 7th to check things out for himself, and he knew the territory well because he'd been there during the Great War. And in those October weeks, the German presence opposite the Americans tripled to 70 divisions, 15 of them panzers, with half of them resupplied with the newer, bigger, better German tanks. Marshall had been getting completely different reports from the British than those he was receiving from American commanders, and Bradley was amazed at the opinion that had developed outside the battlefield in British newspapers and their American affiliates. False reporting that it was the Americans' poor equipment and even poorer soldiers that had stopped Patton. The newspapers were saying that Ike was planning an October offensive when the reality was that they were starved for supplies, meaning food, clothing, and especially ammunition, not to mention the gasoline drought. And Marshall had come to France to let Bradley know that America was optimistic about their upcoming success in the offensive, and what he saw convinced him that the British were not telling the truth, and he began drawing up his post-war Marshall Plan. As FDR was being re-elected for an unprecedented 4th term, there were thousands of German planes being assembled in underground factories, and the hole left by Monty when he went off to Arnhem had given the Germans a path to march right through to the sea, just in front of where the Bulge would come through. And the Americans were not only short on ammo, but were beginning to suffer actual famine from severely scaled-back food rations. Antwerp was in the British sector, while Cherbourg, that was supplying the Americans, was now over 400 miles away, and required more gasoline to make the drive than they could reasonably carry. And when Bradley had to spread the troops out 40 miles farther north to fill the gap left by Monty, the American supply lines were extended that much more. When Marshall had landed on the 7th of October at Verdun, Bradley had insisted on going with him the following day to see Monty, and as Marshall made his way towards Monty's CP, several large planes not in radio contact with Marshall's plane were mysteriously ordered to land on the same runway, planes too large and heavy for that runway, and one of them got stuck 2/3 of the way down, blocking Marshall. But his experienced pilot just gassed it full forward and cleared the stuck plane, and the Americans soared on their way. On the 9th of October, there was a sit-down strike, and Monty suddenly made gasoline available again. But it probably had a lot to do with General Marshall. And when the King of England came to Monty's headquarters on the 14th of October, the King was given a tour of the theater while Hitler sent his favorite General Schwerin to hold Aachen in anticipation of his British guests. The Germans had been ordered to withdraw to Aachen on the 3rd of September, and Monty had ordered the Americans to march towards the outskirts of Aachen, but just to a certain area where they were supposed to stay to get ambushed by those same Germans who had been allowed to leave from Tournai. And the Americans had been given just enough supplies to get there specifically for the Aachen mission in Charlemagne's old hometown on the anniversary of William the Conqueror having taken over England. And for Hitler, that was the anniversary of the day he had withdrawn Germany from the League of Nations in 1935. It was supposed to be the dawning of a new day in Europe, but Bradley had been listening to Patton's crazy historical ranting about British plots and had come to believe. So the Americans held back and merely surrounded that particular area for 3 days, and they threw a wide perimeter around Aachen to prevent any British negotiators from either getting in or out of town, and the American encirclement would last until the 18th of October, after the King of England had gone back to Britain, and Bradley's troops were able to enter the town without interference, and that day Monty would make a new agreement with Ike. The Siegfried Line, or West Wall, was not so much a defensive barrier keeping enemies out of Germany, but served as a highway or corridor where German soldiers and information couriers could travel safely, and it stretched from Frankfurt to Belgium, and was from 1 to 3 miles wide, and the Siegfried Line was designed for use if the railroad lines were bombed, which would not become a problem in Germany until the last month of the war. Aachen was the point in the Siegfried Line where southern German forests met the northern plains, and the Aachen clearing in the middle of the Hürtgen forest was where the Germans were supposed to pour through for the Bulge, and Aachen was a mere 70 miles east of both Antwerp and Brussels, and Wassenach was at the bottom of Castle Hill. The American Big Red One marched into Aachen on the 18th of October, and Ike called a meeting at Monty's headquarters to make sure he would show up. And at the meeting, Bradley told Ike to tell Monty that his northern thrust idea of only marching north into Germany through the plains of Hanover would invite all the Germans to oppose them there, while Patton, also moving south of the Ardennes towards Frankfurt, would split the German army. And Bradley also told Ike to remind Monty that even though the Germans had superior tanks and guns, the Americans had the advantage of better mobility. The building of the West Wall and the Maginot Line had been the result of lessons learned in the Great War, that communications were crucial to issuing orders, and Hitler was well aware of the magnitude of behind-the-lines deliveries because his job during the Great War had been carrying those messages on his motorcycle. The Siegfried Line, as a communications corridor, was most important for peace treaty agents to travel through the countryside without frequently disappearing for unexplainable reasons, or having simply gotten lost or dropped off the edge of the world, and attempting to negotiate with the enemy over the phone or radio often resulted in messages being overheard by the wrong people. To remain in control of their own armies, trails for communication needed to remain open through fortified corridors, and Monty's new plan was that the Americans would be allowed to have more supplies if Bradley promised that Patton would not move until the 10th of November. But Ike knew better than to give the Germans time to regroup and dig in again, as had happened after each and every one of Monty's operations. Any shred of doubt about the British intentions towards making an historical separate peace vanished with this new deadline, since the 10th of November was the day the U.S. Marine Corps had been established in 1775, and Monty's deadline for the 10th of November would not be adhered to by the Americans, even though Bradley officially agreed to wait. But Patton would be sent forward again as a probe in direct violation of Monty's agreement. Bradley continued to broadcast inaccurate forward troop movements during his daily press briefings to forestall the Americans being bombed from the air, and the snapback from the Bulge would carry the American army all the way into the heart of Germany, and that would save the Germans from having to become an ally of Britain. The long-deferred cleanup campaign in the Scheldt had been made many times more difficult by Monty's long delays. To take Walcheren Island, the Canadians were forced to mount an amphibious assault. Meanwhile, air had broken the island's dikes in an effort to flood the enemy positions. As a result, the Canadians fought their way through an exceptionally difficult campaign over battlefields inundated with seawater. Finally, on November 9, 21st Army Group reported that the Scheldt had been opened, and 17 days later, on November 26, the first Allied convoy unloaded in Antwerp. Bradley, page 418. Meanwhile, the German had not been idle. Between early September and mid-December, he tripled his forces on the Western Front to 70 German divisions, and of his 15 panzer divisions, 8 were refitted with Panzer and Tiger tanks. Bradley, page 418. Because of the presence of Americans in the Hürtgen forest on the southern side of Aachen, for those 90 days between Market Garden and the Battle of the Bulge, along with the American victory at Aachen, the Germans were forced to come through the Ardennes 40 miles south of Aachen for their Battle of the Bulge, and they would burn precious gasoline waiting in traffic jams on fewer roads than the route Hitler had planned. The new agreement on the 18th of October had been that Patton could move forward only after the 10th of November, and that the American First, the Big Red One, would move towards the Rhine north of the Ardennes from Aachen. And Monty would bumble around in his English sector guarding the bridges over the Meuse while waiting for the Battle of the Bulge. On the 10th of November, the day Patton was supposed to be allowed to advance, Monty refused to send back the American divisions he had borrowed for his Arnhem adventure. On November 11, when I telephoned George to wish him a happy birthday, he told of an engineer company that had struggled for 2 days to string a pontoon bridge across the river. On the day it was completed, a tank destroyer started across the steel planking to the far shore. As it neared the end, it suddenly veered off the planking and snapped the cable anchoring the bridge to the shore. In an instant, the structure snaked and tumbled off downstream. "The whole damned company sat down in the mud," Patton said, "and bawled like babies." Bradley, page 430 and 31. The German 15th Army was in the Hürtgen forest, 10 miles southeast of Aachen, and the German 7th Army was north in the Roer Plain, and the Americans had 120,000 troops and 700 tanks, but were still being denied supplies, yet were given just enough fuel and ammo for Operation Queen that was supposed to start on the 5th of November, the day after the American elections, but was put off until the 10th, and finally the 16th of November, because the British had been dead certain that Franklin Delano Roosevelt would lose. As it turned out, Queen was merely a holding action, keeping the 1st and the 9th above where the Bulge would come through, so they could be cut off from American command, then given to Monty after the Bulge, so he could march on Berlin using the American troops. Constant bombing in front of the Americans during Queen prevented the 1st and the 9th from routing the Germans in the Hürtgen, busy preparing for the Bulge, and the aerial bombing concentrated just in front of the Americans did nothing to deter the Germans or hinder them in their preparations for the 16th of December, the anniversary of the day the banker from Cologne named Schroeder had asked Hitler to become the Chancellor of Germany, if only he were willing to keep it secret for a little while. Late in September, von Rundstedt was again brought out of retirement and restored to command on the Western Front. Bradley, page 417. On October 12, as Hodges pushed into the shattered northern limits of Aachen, the German High Command issued its directive for the Ardennes offensive. Tactical command of the offensive was assigned Field Marshal Model as commander of Army Group B, but ultimate responsibility for success was vested in the Commander-in-Chief West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. The date was tentatively set for November 26 to 28, contingent, of course, on bad weather and on von Rundstedt's ability to get ready in time. Bradley, page 447. This was the same general who had said, "Make peace, you fools," when Rommel was being disobedient during Operation Epsom, and whose headquarters Rommel had just left when strafed by that lone RAF plane. And while von Rundstedt had been aware of the separate peace plan during Epsom, Hitler was now giving him the honor of bringing the peace to fruition by Christmas. The Bulge was going to stop the Americans once and for all, and von Rundstedt had been headquartered around the same area during the Great War where the Bulge would come through, the town of Namur on the Meuse River. And with winter setting in, the choice for the Americans was to wait until a sufficient buildup of supplies in the spring would guarantee victory, or to move forward with what they had available, and the choice was clear in that the Germans were also building up, including production of a new jet airplane. Moving forward was slow because of bad weather, and Bradley lamented, If the other fellow would only hit us now," I said, "I'd welcome a counterattack. We could kill many more Germans with a good deal less effort if they would only climb out of their holes and come after us for a change." Bradley, page 433. Between the Roer and Rhine rivers, the 30-mile-wide tableland that forms the plains of Cologne offered von Rundstedt an ideal arena for a massed panzer counterattack. If he could catch us astride the Roer, he might hope to stall our drive to the Rhine, perhaps stalemate us through the winter. In any counterattack across the plains of Cologne, von Rundstedt could count upon a powerful weapon in the Roer River. As long as he held the huge Roer dams containing the headwaters of that river, he could unleash a flash flood that would sweep away our bridges and jeopardize our isolated bridgeheads on the plains of Cologne. Destruction of the 180-foot-high Schwamenau Dam, engineers said, would swell the Roer at Düren by 25 feet and create a raging torrent 1.5 miles wide. Clearly we dared not venture beyond the Roer until first we had captured or destroyed those dams. Had we secured them early in November and pushed across the Roer, the enemy would never have dared counterattack us in the Ardennes. Bradley, page 434. Ike went up to talk personally to Monty on the 28th of November, and Monty wrote a letter to Ike, dated the 30th of November, accusing Ike of not following the directive from London for attacking only towards Hanover in the north. And Monty reminded Ike that the Ruhr was supposed to be seized without any damaging of the factories there. And Monty's letter said that the theater should be split in two, putting Monty in command of the north and Bradley in charge of the south, and the dividing line would be the Ardennes forest. All the Americans north of the Ardennes, including the Big Red One and the rest of Hodge's troops, should become Dominion troops under Monty's command. But Ike wrote back, protesting that Monty was wrong, that the Ruhr was only one geographical location on the way to Germany and not a main objective, and Ike carefully detailed in writing precisely why Monty was wrong, swearing he'd given Monty everything he needed for Market Garden, but that it hadn't worked out, so Ike was no longer willing to support Monty's sole thrust to the north proposal. By the time of the Bulge, there were twice as many Americans as British in the theater, and the Germans were quite outnumbered by the Americans, but the Hürtgen forest might have evened the odds. On the 16th of November, when Queen finally began with a sharp increase in aerial bombing that heavily damaged the towns in the forest that might have been able to help feed and shelter the Americans, the Germans remained deeply entrenched in their comfortable bunkers, while the Americans took heavy casualties advancing farther into the Hürtgen forest. Hardened German defenses guarded all the paths in the thick woods where neither artillery nor aerial bombing had much effect, and the Germans were using the Hürtgen forest to train all their new young soldiers for the upcoming Bulge. By the time the Americans reached the Roer River on the 16th of December, the Germans had been able to move vast numbers of men and material into the staging area for the Battle of the Bulge, disguising their troop movements as a defense against Queen. And while the British had been flying bombing raids in the first weeks of December over the area the Americans wanted to move into, the dams were still intact and in German hands, while the Americans had been forced to keep their distance, peering skittishly out from underneath their colored tarps. When the rains first came in November with a blast of wintry cold, our troops were ill-prepared for wintertime campaigning. This was traceable in part to the September crisis in supply, for during our race to the Rhine, I had deliberately bypassed shipments of winter clothing in favor of ammunition and gasoline. Bradley, page 436 and 7. Within 5 short weeks, the winter attack had cost us 64,000 casualties, almost half of them on a 12-mile stretch of the First Army front. And as if this were not already strain enough on the bankrupt replacement system, Trenchfoot added almost 12,000 more. Bradley, page 436. The Germans needed bad weather for the Bulge that would keep the Allied airplanes from flying, and they had to reach the Meuse River by day 4 that was halfway to Antwerp, and they also needed to capture Allied fuel dumps in order to supply their tanks and trucks. The Germans knew where all the supply dumps were, especially the massive American stockpile at Liège. And German morale was high because the Meuse River had been sung about in the first stanza of the Weimar Republic's national anthem since 1922. Monty had ordered the bridges at Namur, Dinant, and Givet to be protected by the British 30 Corps until the 19th of December, and Charles de Gaulle had taken a bullet at Dinant during the Great War. But the Germans didn't get to Dinant until the 22nd of December, and by the 24th were completely stopped by the Americans, although the Germans had managed to send scouts ahead to the Meuse. The German commanders had fought in the Ardennes during the Great War, so they knew the territory intimately. And the Americans in front of the Bulge had been outnumbered 6-1 on the 16th of December, and the German tanks could only be stopped by M26 tank destroyers, of which the Americans there had pitifully few, most of them being down south with Patton. The only advantage the Americans had was a variable timing fuse on an artillery shell that was made in America and had just been supplied to use for the first time. And the timing fuse was a small radio transmitter with a receiver in the nose of each shell that exploded electronically at a given distance, and this new invention would turn the tide against the Germans in the Bulge. The Americans had been resting in the Ardennes forest right outside one of Goering's hunting preserves, and the Ardennes was 50 miles away from the Meuse at Namur. And Patton and Hodges were 90 miles apart on either side of the Ardennes, where trout streams foamed through the steep hills of this quiet middle sector, and wild boar roamed its forest. Later, the Luxembourg forest warden was to complain that GIs in their zest for barbecued pork were hunting the boar in low-flying cubs with Thompson submachine guns. Inventive, I agreed, but a trifle rough on the game. Bradley, page 428. Hitler had moved from his Wolf's Lair headquarters in Prussia to the Kranzberg Castle in Gießen on the 11th of December for the Bulge. And Hitler had stayed at that Kranzberg Castle when the Germans marched into France in May of 1940, and Gießen was on the River Lahn, 25 miles north of Frankfurt and 75 miles east of Cologne. To General Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 6th SS Panzer Army, Hitler entrusted the main effort in spearheading the offensive, 6th SS Panzer Army was to slash through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse between Huy and Liège, then race northwest toward Antwerp, where he hoped to pirate our stores to supply his forces. Meanwhile, a splinter column was to break off north of the Meuse, bypass Liège, and strike for the focal communications center of Ninth Army at Maastricht. To the left of that major tank thrust, the 5th Panzer Army was to parallel its breakthrough, bridge the Meuse between Dinant and Namur, and drive on north towards Brussels to protect the left flank and rear of Sepp Dietrich. Bradley, page 447 and 8. Monty's headquarters was in Brussels, only 35 miles away from Namur, and 5th Panzer was on its way to meet Monty in Brussels to set up the separate peace. Sepp Dietrich was on his way to Liège, that was 35 miles downriver from Namur, and Liège was 60 miles away from Antwerp, and Antwerp was 25 miles due north of Brussels. At Army Group, we concluded his target lay in the swollen dumps of Liège. I could not yet believe that his ambitions stretched beyond Liège to Antwerp. Bradley, page 459. Meanwhile, the agents that we slipped through the enemy's lines disappeared into the winter and were never heard from again. Bradley, page 451. The Americans faced 36 of the Germans' best divisions, while 2 of the American divisions had just come through the Hürtgen forest, and another 2 were new green troops. And the Germans did the Bulge, with over 400,000 men, 600 tanks and 900 tank vehicles, 4,000 artillery guns and 1,000 planes, and over a quarter of these German soldiers would not survive the Bulge, while the Americans took 100,000 casualties with 15,000 killed, 60,000 wounded, and 25,000 missing or captured. The British had 1,400 casualties, with 200 killed and 1,200 wounded or missing, and among the American casualties were 15,000 soldiers sent back from the front with frozen feet, and they were given alcohol which was contraindicated for frostbite, but at that point it didn't matter anymore. The Americans overrun by the Bulge numbered 230,000. And Bradley said the American casualties would have been higher had the line in front of the Ardennes not been so thinly held, and that the mobility of the Americans won the day over a greater number of troops. As Hodges thinned his Roer River front to fend off the panzers on the right of his line and dig in on a defensive position between the Bulge and the Meuse River, I made ready to call off Patton's offensive in the Saar. While First Army rolled with the Germans' Bulge offensive in the north, Third Army would slash into its underbelly by wheeling up from the Saar. George was dismayed at the prospect of abandoning his toehold in the Siegfried line, but what the hell, he shrugged. We'll still be killing Krauts. Bradley, page 459. As the enemy drove deeper into the Ardennes, searching for an unblocked road north to the Meuse, Hodges extended his line in a frantic effort to contain him. If Sepp Dietrich panzers were to break through that wall and drive on to Liège, Hodges would probably have been compelled to slacken his grip on the Malmedy's shoulder. And it was there that he saved First Army by holding the enemy's main force to a draw. Bradley, page 460. Italics in original for main in enemy's main force. Hitler had landed 800 German paratroopers down the road from Malmedy in their only nighttime drop of the war, but only 300 of them would survive the same snowstorm that delayed air support during the first week of the Bulge, and only 100 of these would make it back to Germany. The Americans who had complained about Patton's insistence on uniform protocol became grateful because of this Operation Griffin led by Otto Skorzeny, where Germans wearing American uniforms were sabotaging the Americans behind the lines, and their main objective had been to take over the bridges Monty was guarding by the 20th or day 4 of the Bulge, but the rumor of Griffin had spread too quickly for Skorzeny to have much success. On the evening of December 18, I had intended to run up through Bastogne to Spa until Hodges' aide telephoned to suggest that I come instead by air. English-speaking Germans in captured American ODs had infiltrated our lines in a brash attempt to panic our rear areas. Captured enemy orders for the recruitment of those quote-unquote reconnaissance units had fallen into our hands 2 weeks before. Volunteers were to be selected and trained by the notorious Lieutenant Colonel Otto Skorzeny, the airborne privateer who the year before had snatched Mussolini out of the Italian hotel in which he had been imprisoned following his fall from power. Most of these GI-uniformed enemy troops were cut down before they reached the Meuse, but not until 500,000 GIs played cat and mouse with each other each time they met on the road. Neither rank nor credentials nor protests spared the traveler an inquisition at each intersection he passed. 3 times I was ordered to prove my identity by cautious GIs. The first time by identifying Springfield as the capital of Illinois. Parenthesis, my questioner held out for Chicago, close parenthesis. The second time by locating the guard between the center and tackle on a line of scrimmage. The third time by naming the then current spouse of a blonde named Betty Grable. Grable stopped me, but the sentry did not. Pleased at having stumped me, he nevertheless passed me on. Bradley, page 457-9. After Bradley organized his defense against the Bulge and the situation was stabilized, Ike gave the 1st Army and the 9th Army to Monty on the 20th of December, since the Bulge had split the Americans and trapped the 1st and the 9th in the British sector to the north. Although Bradley said he was still in touch with his men over alternate phone lines running behind the lines and was in radio communication with Ike, and the British newspapers reported that the weak Americans had been saved by Monty. With division, corps, and army staffs schooled in the same language, practices, and techniques, we could resort to sketchy oral orders with an assurance of perfect understanding between U.S. commands. Those orders, in turn, were transmitted easily over the most valued accessory of all, the elaborate telephone system we carried with us into the field. From my desk in Luxembourg, I was never more than 30 seconds by phone from any of the armies. If necessary, I could have called every division on the line. Although Hodges was fighting a touch-and-go battle on the evening of December 19, I was not perturbed so long as he held tightly to the Malmedy shoulder. Sepp Dietrich had already shattered 4 first-rate divisions against that position before diverting his main effort south through the road center at St. Vith. There, where 5 principal highways intersected in the center of that small Belgian town, Hodges had blocked the German advance with his 7th Armored Division. Dietrich's unwieldy columns piled up in a jam behind. As his panzers forked north and south in an effort to avoid that intersection, they soon lost their precious momentum on the muddy secondary roads that made the Ardennes so treacherous a vehicle trap. Bradley, page 464, brackets, italics in original for Maine in his main effort, close brackets. St. Vith was an important road junction that the Germans needed to seize in order to make it to the Meuse, and Monty ordered that St. Vith be evacuated on the 21st of December, but the Americans stayed in their positions surrounding St. Vith in spite of Monty's orders, primarily because an incredible snowstorm had snowed them in that morning, and these Americans held back the Germans long enough to ruin the Bulge for both the Germans and the British.